Raichu, you might think you're an upgrade from Pikachu, but let's be real, you're just a bigger, less adorable version with an identity crisis. Your Thunderbolt might pack more power, but it's still just a flashy light show compared to real electric Pokemon. Your tail might be impressive, but it's more like a propeller that spins you in circles of mediocrity. And those ears of yours? They are less radar dish and more oversized earmuffs. Face it, Raichu, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a middle child, always overshadowed by your younger, cuter sibling and never quite standing out on your own. Sandshrew, you're like the desert version of a snowball, small, round, and easily forgotten. Your claim to fame is being the ground-type Pokemon that no one remembers until they accidentally step on you in the desert. Your sand attack move? It's less of an attack and more of a nuisance, like getting sand in your shoes. Your claws might look sharp, but they're about as threatening as a kitten's first attempt at scratching. And that tough exterior? It's more like a sandbox toy than armor. Face it, Sandshrew, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a tumbleweed, blown around by the wind and barely making an impact. Sandslash, you may have evolved from Sandshrew, but let's be honest, you're just a spiky hedgehog wannabe stuck in the desert. Your slash move? It's about as sharp as a butter knife compared to real slashing attacks. Your spines might look impressive, but they are more for show than defense. And those claws? They are like tiny shovels, great for digging holes, not so great for battles. Your claim to fame is being the ground type that tries too hard to be edgy. Face it, Sandslash, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a cactus, prickly on the outside, but ultimately just another desert plant waiting to be watered. Nidoran, you're like the forgotten sidekick in the Nidoran duo, overshadowed by your counterpart and barely noticeable in the tall grass. Your double kick move? It's less of a powerful strike and more of a clumsy attempt to impress. Your horns might look sharp, but they are more like decorative accessories than actual weapons. And those big ears of yours? They make you look like a rabbit that got lost in the wrong game. Face it, Nidoran, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a background character, always there, but never the main attraction. Nidorina, you're like the middle manager of the Nidoran evolution line, trying to be significant but ultimately forgettable. Your poison sting move? It's less venomous and more like a gentle poke with a safety pin. Your claim to fame is being the slightly larger version of Nidoran, but without any real standout qualities. Those ears of yours? They are like oversized antennas picking up signals of mediocrity. And that tail? It's more of a fashion accessory than a weapon. Face it, Nidorina, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a placeholder, waiting for something more interesting to come along and take your place. Nidoqueen, you might think you're the queen of the Nidoran evolution line, but let's be real, you're just a bulky, overgrown version of Nidorina with a crown that doesn't quite fit. Your earthquake move? It's about as earth-shattering as a tiny pebble dropped in a pond. Your horns might look impressive, but they are more like decorative headgear than deadly weapons. And those big, muscular arms? They make you look more like a bodybuilder trying too hard to be intimidating. Face it, Nidoqueen, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a drama queen, loud, tension-seeking, but ultimately not as powerful as you think you are. Nidoran, you're like the younger brother who's always trying to prove himself but never quite gets there. Your peck move? It's less of a fearsome attack and more of a playful peck like a chicken. Your claim to fame is being overshadowed by your counterpart, Nidoran. Those tiny horns of yours? They are more like tiny bumps on your head than intimidating weapons. And that purple color? It makes you look more like a rejected great than a formidable opponent. Face it, Nidoran, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a little brother, always trying to keep up, but never quite making the cut. Nidorino, you're like the adolescent rebel of the Nidoran evolution line, full of spikes and attitude but lacking in substance. Your horn attack move? It's less of a piercing strike and more of a clumsy jab. Your claim to fame is being the middle evolution that everyone forgets about on their way to Nidoking. Those big ears of yours? They make you look more like a rabbit caught in headlights than a fearsome fighter. And those spikes on your back? They are more for show than actual defense. Face it, Nidorino, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a teenager going through a rebellious phase, loud, brash, but ultimately still just figuring things out. Nidoking, you may be the king of the Nidoran evolution line, but let's be honest, you're just a hulking mass of spikes and misplaced swagger. Your earthquake move? It's about as earth-shattering as a gentle rumble in the distance. Your horns might look impressive, but they are more like oversized decorations than deadly weapons. And those muscular arms of yours? They make you look like you skipped leg day but overcompensated with upper body strength. Your claim to fame is being the brute force that trainers turn to when they need a ground type, but let's face it, you're more brawn than brains. Face it, Nidoking, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a bulldozer, loud, powerful, but ultimately lacking finesse. Clefairy, you're like the Pokemon that tried too hard to be cute and ended up as a forgettable fairy type. Your metronome move? It's less of a strategic masterpiece and more of a random roll of the dice. Your claim to fame is being overshadowed by your evolution, Clefable. Those wings of yours? They are more decorative than functional, like a dress-up costume for a school play. And that high-pitched cry of yours? It's less enchanting and more like a squeaky toy that got stepped on. Face it, Clefairy, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a shooting star, briefly dazzling, but quickly fading into obscurity. Clefable, you may have evolved from Clefairy, but let's be honest, you're just a larger version with a bigger moon obsession. Your Moonblast move? It's more of a gentle breeze than a powerful blast. Your claim to fame is being the fairy type that everyone remembers but often overlooks in battles. Those big, fluffy ears of yours? They make you look more like a cuddly toy than a formidable opponent. And that moon on your forehead? It's like a glowing target saying, hit me here. Face it, Clefable, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a bedtime story, comforting and familiar, but not exactly thrilling. Vulpix, you're like the cute fox Pokemon that tries to be mysterious but ends up just being a cuddly fire hazard. Your Fire Spin move? It's more like a gentle campfire compared to real fire-type attacks. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that trainers want for their adorable factor, but rarely use in serious battles. Those six tails of yours? They are more like fluffy accessories than tools for combat. And that innocent gaze? It's more likely to charm someone into petting you than intimidating them. Face it, Vulpix, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a cute plush toy, adorable to look at, but not much use in a real fight. Ninetales, you may have evolved from Vulpix, but let's be real, you're just a fancier fox with a few extra tails and a lot of attitude. Your Flamethrower move? It's less of a blazing inferno and more of a gentle breeze compared to stronger fire attacks. Your claim to fame is being the majestic fox Pokemon that everyone admires for its beauty but rarely fears in battle. Those Ninetales of yours? They are more for show than actual combat prowess. And that mystical aura you exude? It's like trying to impress with smoke and mirrors. Face it, Ninetales, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a glamour model, stunning to look at, but lacking the substance to back it up in a serious showdown. Jigglypuff, you're like the balloon Pokemon that someone accidentally let go of, floaty, soft, and easily overlooked. Your Sync move? It's less of a lullaby and more like a lousy karaoke attempt. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that puts everyone to sleep, including your opponents in battle. Those big, doe eyes of yours? They make you look more like a lost child stuffed toy than a fierce fighter. And that microphone-shaped tuft of hair? It's like you're trying to be a pop star but can't hit the high notes. Face it, Jigglypuff, you're the Pokemon equivalent of background music, pleasant to hear for a moment, but quickly tuned out. Wigglytuff, you may have evolved from Jigglypuff, but let's be honest, you're just a rounder, fluffier version with a bit more oomph. Your Hyper Voice move? It's more of a squeaky yawn compared to the powerful sound attacks of other Pokemon. Your claim to fame is being the fairy type that's easy to underestimate in battles. Those big, round eyes of yours? They make you look perpetually surprised, like you just stumbled into the spotlight accidentally. And that cotton candy-like fur? It's more for hugging than intimidating opponents. Face it, Wigglytuff, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a gentle giant, cute and cuddly, but not exactly striking fear into anyone's heart. Zubat, you're like the annoying bat Pokemon that everyone encounters in caves and wishes would just disappear. Your Supersonic move? It's less of a disorienting screech and more of a mild annoyance. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that trainers accidentally run into while searching for something better. Those fangs of yours? They are more like tiny needles than menacing weapons. And those blank, expressionless eyes? They make you look more like a confused fruit bat than a formidable opponent. Face it, Zubat, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a pest, always buzzing around where you're not wanted and never making a lasting impression. Golbat, you may have evolved from Zubat, but let's be honest, you're just a bigger, more obnoxious version with an even louder screech. Your Air Slash move? It's more of a gentle breeze compared to the slicing attacks of real flying types. Your claim to fame is being the vampire bat Pokemon that no one wants to encounter in a dark cave. Those fangs of yours? They are more for show than actual biting power. And that perpetual grin? It's more creepy than intimidating. Face it, Golbat, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a nocturnal nuisance, always flying around where you're not wanted and never quite earning respect in battles. Oddish, you're like the forgotten wee Pokemon that's more likely to end up in a salad than a serious battle. Your Absorb move? It's less of a draining attack and more of a gentle sip from a water fountain. Your claim to fame is being the grass poison type that's easy to overlook in the wild. Those blue leaves of yours? They are more wilted than vibrant, like you forgot to water yourself. And that blank expression? It's less cute and more like you've seen one too many trainers pass you by. Face it, Oddish, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a dandelion, pretty to some, but ultimately just a nuisance in the garden of strong Pokemon. Gloom, you're like the awkward middle child of the Oddish evolution line, always drooling and smelling like a compost heap. Your Stun Spore move? It's less of a stunning attack and more like a mild inconvenience, like stepping in gum. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that looks like it's perpetually under the weather. Those petals of yours? They are more wilted and sad than vibrant and dangerous. And that constant drool? It's more gross than intimidating, making you look like you need a napkin instead of a battle. Face it, Gloom, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a neglected houseplant, droopy, unappealing, and always looking like you need some care. Vileplume, you might think you're impressive with that giant flower on your head, but let's be real, you're just a walking allergy attack waiting to happen. Your Petal Dance move? It's more like a clumsy shuffle compared to the graceful attacks of real grass types. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that looks like it should be in a bouquet, not a battle. Those petals of yours? They are less dazzling and more like an oversized hat you can't take off. And that Stun Spore? It's about as effective as sneezing on someone. Face it, Vileplume, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a garden decoration, nice to look at from afar, but not very useful up close. Paras, you're like the bug Pokemon that tried to be a fungus and ended up as a confused mess. Your Spore move? It's less of a powerful attack and more like a light dusting that annoys opponents. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that no one wants to encounter while looking for something better. Those mushrooms on your back. They look more like a bad case of mold than a strategic advantage. And those tiny eyes? They make you look perpetually surprised, like you're always in over your head. Face it, Paras, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a garden pest, easily squashed and more of a nuisance than a threat. Parasect, you might think you're terrifying with that giant mushroom controlling your body, but let's face it, you're more creepy than threatening. Your Spore move? It's about as impactful as sprinkling salt on a meal. Your claim to fame is being a bug Pokemon that's half fungus and all weird. Those blank, zombie-like eyes? They make you look like you've seen better days, days when you weren't under fungal control. And that mushroom on your back? It's less of a powerful symbiotic partner and more like an oversized hat you can't get rid of. Face it, Parasect, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a horror movie extra, creepy background noise without any real impact. Venonat, you're like the fluff ball that tried to be a bug but ended up as a ball of confusion. Your Poison Powder move? It's more of a sneeze than a serious attack. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that looks like it belongs in a bad sci-fi movie. Those big, red eyes? They are less intimidating and more like oversized goggles that don't quite fit. And that fuzzy exterior? It's more like a dust bunny than a protective coat. Face it, Venonat, you're the Pokemon equivalent of an overgrown insect, awkward, easily swatted, and trying too hard to look fierce. Venomoth, you may have evolved from Venonat, but let's be real, you're just a bigger bug with some sparkly wings. Your Silver Wind move? It's more like a gentle breeze than a gust of power. Your claim to fame is being the moth Pokemon that trainers forget about until they accidentally encounter you. Those compound eyes? They make you look more like a bug zapper's next target than a formidable opponent. And those powdery wings? They are more delicate decoration than dangerous weapon. Face it, Venomoth, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a moth drawn to a flame, pretty to look at for a second but ultimately just a fleeting distraction. Diglett, you're like the mole Pokemon that never quite made it out of the ground. Your Dig move? It's less of a strategic retreat and more like you're just hiding from the real fight. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that's perpetually stuck underground. That tiny nose of yours? It looks more like a little button than anything useful. And those beady eyes? They make you look like you're always in a state of surprise, like you just realized you're still a Diglett. Face it, Diglett, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a whack-a-mole, popping up just to get knocked back down and never really making an impact. Doug Trio, you might think you're impressive with 3 heads, but let's be honest, you're just a trio of Diglets stuck in a perpetual group hug. Your Earthquake move? It's less of a seismic event and more like a gentle tremor. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that tries to make up for its small size with sheer numbers, but ends up just being 3 times as annoying. Those 3 tiny noses? They look like a bad joke from a comedy club. And your constant digging? It's like you're always trying to escape from the fact that you're not as intimidating as you think you are. Face it, Doug Trio, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a 3-ring circus, loud, crowded, and ultimately just a lot of fuss with no real substance.